Hi there, I'm Dr. Victoria Mattingly here with my friend and colleague, Dr. Paul Spradley, and we want to talk about a interesting comparison and cautionary tale of two movements and how those impacted the workplace, and particularly interpersonal relationships in the workplace. Paul, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so we're familiar with most people are familiar with the Me Too movement, right? And the Me Too movement, I don't really know when its start was, but it was right. Like there's a lot of publicity around Harvey Weinstein, around Bill Cosby, around other prominent figures. There's a letter that was written about the culture of Uber at the time. So there's all these things that were coming out, and women were saying that yes, that happened to me too. That's where the Me Too uh, hashtag, the idea came from, right? Like this happened to me as well. Like the idea that a man would treat me in this way, and so right now we're seeing another movement, which I'll call the Black Lives Matter movement, even though both have been around for a while. More recently, I think people are paying attention to the idea that Black Lives Matter and what that means, the context around that. And I think that you and I were talking a couple of weeks ago and just kind of stumbled upon this really interesting concept or learning opportunity, I think. So what first of all, what was your take on the Me Too movement?
Yeah, so I mean, what happened was for the first time, something as you said, Me Too was not new in 2016. That's really when it exploded and really took center stage in media and society, but most importantly for our work in the workplace, right? And so things that used to get swept under the rug or just be, oh, that's just how he is, that's just how it is here, was no longer acceptable. And so we had this, beautiful, incredible movement that is empowering women, trusting when women say that they are being sexually discriminated against, sexually assaulted at work, even just the subtle, like implicit biases against women, they're actually being taken seriously. But what had happened, the backlash of that movement and an unintended consequence of that movement is that men in the workplace stopped talking with women altogether. Whereas women just wanted to be respected, they ended up getting completely excluded as a result of Me Too. And not all workplaces, of course, but it was a phenomenon, and it still very much exists where women are being left out of conversations. They're not being considered, for leadership roles. They're not being mentored and sponsored at the same rates as their male counterparts, because men are afraid to be alone with women at work because they don't know what to do. And in that vein, how can we prevent that same unintended consequence with the Black Lives Matter movement in the workplace, where we, right now we're having all the attention and the organizations are stepping up and trying to do the right thing, but how can we prevent white people from just not wanting to interact or engage with Black people in the workplace out of fear of doing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing, and just, all right, I'm just not even gonna, engage with people of color at work because I don't want to be one of these bad white people that I keep reading and hearing about out there.
Right. Yeah. So, and that it's so, this topic is so nuanced because there's going to be another movement, right? Or we saw before the Me Too movement, we saw a movement with the LGBTQ community, right? Like the idea of pride and celebrating pride heritage and the culture. And so with each of these movements, there's a sense of empowerment for the marginalized community. And then there's a sense of sort of disengagement and disconnection from the, I guess you call them the other, right? The person who's the identifies as the opposite of, because there's not a healthy space to grow. And I think that's like when you look at some of the backlash or some of the articles around the Me Too movement, guys were being told for the first time that the way that they're doing something is wrong. And people will say, but you had to know that it was wrong. Maybe, but it was also an acceptable part of the culture. So and it's not that it meant that I'm condoning that was bad or wrong. I'm saying that there has to be some space, and I would say even grace, that if I learned something, if I've been practicing something for years and thinking this way for years, that overnight, it's going to take longer than overnight for me to do something different.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that space, and people will say things like, well, I mean, now you're giving in the Black Lives Matter movement, you're giving white people permission to continue to be racist. I'm not saying that. I'm not giving men permission to continue to be sexist. I'm not giving straight Americans the permission to be homophobic. What I'm saying is there has to be space to practice something new, right? Like I have a worldview, an identity, a framework of how I've understood things, how I've acted, and I need to practice new behaviors. And that, I mean, there's research that talks about a habit takes 21 days even, right? Like to start something new. And these are deeply ingrained spaces. So I think that one of the things that's been missing is the space to partner and grow together.
Yes. And space, but another term that you use was grace. And this recognition that this is hard, challenging work. And even though what was in the past is no longer acceptable in the present, it's that grace, knowing that, recognizing I'm going to trip up, I'm going to make mistakes, but I'm still trying to do the right thing. That I'm punishing, my past self, right? I'm dealing with all of that, internal like reckoning about how things were bad in this old world, but then having the grace to then be able to venture into this new uncharted territory. And the partnerships are so important for that, because that space that you're talking about, Paul, I feel like one way to create that are these, one-on-one conversations, and these, just having real talk about things like race or gender, sexual orientation at work. Like that's where we're going to create that space on these conversations across difference to actually figure out what this new world looks like together, versus, well, I don't know what's going on now, so I'm just going to throw up my arms and be done with this, and just not interact with anyone different than me out of, because that's easier.
That is easier. And that's where we'll default to, right? Like we'll retreat into our camps if we're not given the opportunity to grow into this new version of ourselves, right? We'll retreat back to what we've done if I'm not given the capacity, the grace to grow into this new version of me. And so that's what I think it's important for you and I, when we go into organizations as diversity and inclusion trainers, experts, our goal is to get a critical mass of the people that are in that room to start this journey, to move from here, at least to here. And they might not move that day. Like it might take a little bit of time, but we want to create the space. So my question to you is, if you could go back and if you were a female leader in an organization and it was during the Me Too movement and there's conflict happening between men and women, what might you recommend doing differently? And then I'll answer the question about how Black Americans can, what I think can happen differently so that white people are being brought along as partners.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one would just be having really candid, like open communication, open conversations, leaders being those role models and going there and having those discussions and seeing more, partnerships across gender in that regard. And then, following through. So maybe it's rolling out a reverse mentoring program where you have junior female employees mentoring more senior level male employees, and having because if people are afraid because they don't know what to do, building that in, here's your talking points, here's 5 conversation starters, like just where to begin. Here's the expectation, meet with this person once a month, have a cup of coffee, and creating a culture of this, having awkward conversations, uncomfortable conversations, because if you make that more of the expectations, those conversations are going to become less and less awkward and uncomfortable because it's going to be part of the culture as a result.
Right.
So just a few ideas off the top of my head.
Yeah. So, and I would, I think that in this space of bringing white people along as partners in the Black Lives Matter movement, white people are going to trip up, man. Like they're going to say something that's just clumsy. And I think that there's a way to correct a person without closing the door to ever having that happen again, right? So a white person comes and says, listen, I love everything about the Black culture and I want to touch your hair. I just love everything about you. I hope that you are okay with, and they're apologetic and they're just, they're stumbling over their words and things like that. I know that it's coming from a space of they want to grow, right? And so I had friends that said, "Hey, what can I do?" And I said, "Well, start by educating yourself, or start by listening, right? Like authentically listening. Don't feel the need to jump in. What does that look like in organizational spaces where where senior leadership is listening to their Black employees and the experiences? And it's okay if I, as a Black employee, don't want to speak to the senior leadership because I might still be hurt. I might still be upset. But I think that there's other ways to gather information. So listening is going to be, it sounds really simple, but it hasn't happened. And then I think, you know, the idea of practicing grace, if you have the capacity to give it as a Black American, if you have the capacity to give it. If I was just pulled over yesterday and was harassed by a white officer, and then today you come to me and say, "Hey, I really want to lean into being an ally to Black and brown people," I may not be interested in helping you get there, right?
And
Because
that's okay.
and that is okay.
That's okay.
And so I just think that understanding on both ends, like the idea of having grace, patience. If you have the capacity to have patience, then I would say practice it.
I love it. Space and grace. Thank you for the space and grace today, Paul.
No problem.